At dawn, frost sealed the ground beside a rural pull-off, where a maintenance worker noticed tire arcs, a dropped mitten, and disturbed gravel leading to a silent tree line, the air holding a metallic stillness that made notebooks open and radios go quiet before the tape arrived and daylight settled. If you like stories like this, make sure to subscribe and like the video. State police logged the scene on December 3, 2001, in the hill country north of Concord, New Hampshire, as winter tightened and holiday lights blinked along Route 4. The missing person flyers already taped to grocery doors carried the name Emily Harrington, age 22, last seen after a Thanksgiving weekend shift ended early. Her car was found days earlier in a commuter lot dusted with salt, unlocked, keys gone, no signs of theft. Patrol reports noted the temperature, the wind, the absence of footprints, and a timeline narrowed by credit receipts and a voicemail timestamp that stopped just before dusk. The discovery at the pull-off shifted the inquiry from search to homicide protocol without spectacle. Evidence markers rose slowly. Photographs documented angles and distances. A preliminary medical assessment suggested exposure and blunt force without elaboration, pending autopsy, as snow threatened to erase context. Emily Harrington had grown up in Merrimack County, the oldest daughter in a practical household working retail while finishing community college credits. December was supposed to bring overtime pay and a modest Christmas trip. Instead, investigators reconstructed her final 48 hours minute by minute. Bank logs showed a small withdrawal on Black Friday afternoon. A gas receipt placed her southbound near Bow. Surveillance yielded silhouettes and headlights but no plate. Witness statements were procedural, restrained, and frustratingly ordinary, the kind that fill boxes without answers. The autopsy, conducted under fluorescent calm, confirmed trauma inconsistent with a fall and estimated time of death within a narrow winter window. Fibers and trace grit were collected, sealed, and catalogued. Toxicology was unremarkable. Cause and manner were recorded conservatively. Media coverage stayed local and sober, framed by candlelight vigils and a courthouse press bench cleared by 5. Detectives canvassed seasonal parties, late-night shifts, and snowplow routes. A tip line rang through Christmas Eve and fell quiet after New Year's. Early persons of interest were vetted and released. A coworker's alibi held. A former boyfriend's timeline checked out. Without DNA hits or eyewitness certainty, the case cooled as budgets tightened and evidence moved to long-term storage. Years passed. Emily's parents kept a small box by the phone, receipts and photographs yellowing. Each December, the town printed her name again, and patrol cars cruised the same roads under the same frost, waiting for something new. The file slept in a climate-controlled room until advances in forensic genealogy reopened doors once sealed. In 2019, analysts re-examined preserved fibers and a partial profile, seeking kinship rather than identity, a lawful pivot approved by prosecutors. Records pointed toward a family tree anchored in central New Hampshire. Methodical work narrowed branches. Old traffic stops resurfaced. A winter storm delayed interviews, but patience defined the process, and warrants followed probable cause. Attention settled on a man who had plowed roots near the pull-off in 2001 and left the state soon after. Employment records aligned with weather logs. A discarded coffee cup provided a fresh sample under court order. The comparison was definitive. Investigators rebuilt the timeline, placing Emily's car near the lot, the plow near the road, and the intersection of opportunity within minutes. Search warrants recovered fibers consistent with those cataloged years earlier. An arrest in late autumn brought national attention and local disbelief. The suspect, then in his 50s, was extradited and charged under statutes unchanged since 2001. Indictment documents avoided flourish, relying on records and science. For the community, the holidays returned with a different weight. Church bulletins mentioned the case once, then not at all. The courthouse file thickened. Emily Harrington's name moved from flyers to filings. Trial preparation would follow with motions, expert testimony, and a calendar mindful of winter travel. The narrative would conclude years later with a verdict and sentence. For now, procedure ruled and silence returned to the road. Through the winter that followed, the investigation entered a disciplined holding pattern defined by paperwork, repetition, and restraint. Detectives compiled a master timeline that stretched from Thanksgiving morning through the first snowfall of December, aligning bank activity, traffic counts, and weather records. Snowfall totals mattered because plow routes created predictable windows of isolation along secondary roads. Patrol logs showed when shoulders were cleared and when visibility fell, narrowing the possible movement of any vehicle without witnesses. The pull-off where evidence was found sat between two bends, a place drivers passed without stopping unless necessary. Photographs taken in early light captured the angles of approach and the shallow grade, details that would later be revisited with fresh eyes. Emily Harrington's last confirmed movements were mundane and carefully sourced. A shift ended early due to slow holiday foot traffic. A small grocery purchase was logged before dusk. Phone records showed brief calls to family earlier in the day and nothing after early evening. The absence of late activity was itself a data point, consistent with a short interruption rather than a planned trip. Investigators canvassed the parking lot where her car had been left. The absence of forced entry suggested familiarity or compliance without overt threat. Latent prints were lifted from the door frame and steering wheel, yielding nothing suitable for comparison at the time. A single fiber on the passenger seat was preserved because it did not match the upholstery. As December advanced, the autopsy findings were finalized with conservative language. The report noted injuries consistent with blunt force and environmental exposure, with no intoxicants present. The manner was listed in accordance with standards, avoiding conjecture. Time of death was bracketed by meteorological data and stomach contents, producing a narrow window that aligned with the early evening. These findings guided interviews. Friends described Emily as cautious and punctual. Coworkers confirmed she rarely deviated from routine. A former relationship was examined thoroughly and ruled out through verified travel and receipts. Each exclusion was documented, signed, and filed. Media coverage reflected the town's temperament. Local papers printed short updates near the classifieds. Radio stations mentioned the case between weather forecasts and holiday closures. There was no frenzy, only persistence. Flyers stayed on cork boards through New Year's, then curled at the corners. Investigators received tips that ranged from earnest to vague, all logged and assessed. None produced probable cause. By February, the case transitioned to a cold status without surrendering accuracy. Evidence was inventoried for long-term storage. The fiber was sealed again. The partial biological sample, insufficient for a direct match, was preserved according to protocol that would later prove essential. Years moved forward. Emily's parents marked holidays with a measured quiet, attending services and leaving early. Detectives rotated assignments, but the file remained intact, its index updated when new methods emerged. In the mid-2000s, DNA databases expanded, yet the profile remained partial. Analysts ran comparisons that returned no hits. Each negative result was recorded. The case resurfaced briefly when a similar offense occurred in another state, but differences in method and geography led to a cautious dismissal. The discipline of saying no protected the integrity of the record. By the late 2000s, forensic science shifted incrementally. Touch DNA techniques improved. The preserved fiber was re-examined, revealing trace material suitable for deeper analysis. Funding constraints delayed action, but a grant secured in the following decade allowed a reprocessing under modern standards. The result was still incomplete, but it suggested a path forward that did not exist before. Investigators consulted legal advisors about emerging genealogical methods, emphasizing consent, privacy, and warrants. The approach required patience and transparency. In the late 2010s, with approvals in place, analysts uploaded a lawful profile to a public database designed for investigative use. The search did not name a suspect. It produced distant relatives. From there, a family tree was constructed backward and outward, generation by generation, guided by public records, obituaries, and census data. The work was meticulous and slow. Winter storms delayed courthouse visits. Clerks retrieved microfilm. A name appeared repeatedly near the geographic center of the tree, associated with seasonal work and equipment operation. Investigators compared this name against records from 2001. Employment files showed plow assignments that winter. Route maps matched the road near the pull-off. A traffic citation from the same period placed the individual nearby within weeks of Emily's disappearance. The man had relocated soon after, a fact that did not imply guilt but warranted attention. Detectives sought corroboration. They reviewed fuel logs, maintenance schedules, and weather alerts. The pattern held. Legal steps followed in sequence. A judge authorized discreet collection of discarded material to obtain a fresh sample. The comparison returned a conclusive match to the preserved evidence. The finding was reviewed by independent analysts. Prosecutors examined the chain of custody from 2001 to the present, confirming seals and logs. Only after these checks did the case move forward. When the arrest came, it occurred without spectacle, timed between holidays to avoid disruption. The community reacted with surprise rather than celebration. Investigators briefed the family privately, presenting documents rather than promises. The charging instrument outlined counts consistent with the evidence and the statute. Pretrial motions addressed admissibility and scope. Experts prepared to explain methods in plain terms. The rebuilt timeline placed Emily's car at the commuter lot, the plow on its route, and the pull-off as an opportunity zone created by weather and routine. Fiber transfer explained presence without speculation. The absence of other viable suspects strengthened the case without overstating certainty. As winter returned, the courthouse warmed under steady lights. The file that had waited through so many Decembers was active again, its pages turning with care toward resolution. As the case advanced toward trial, the focus narrowed to verification and clarity rather than drama. Prosecutors organized evidence around procedure, showing how each step complied with law and standard practice. The genealogical analysis was contextualized as a tool, not a shortcut, and the court record emphasized that the arrest rested on a conventional DNA comparison obtained with authorization. The preserved materials from 2001 were introduced through custodians who testified to storage conditions, labeling, and audits. Logs showed temperatures, access points, and the absence of contamination. This foundation mattered to a jury likely to value order and accountability. The defense examined timelines and distances, questioning opportunity without spectacle. Investigators responded by laying out weather reports hour by hour, using archived forecasts and plow dispatch notes to establish road conditions. Snowfall intensity reduced traffic and visibility, explaining the absence of witnesses. Traffic counters from state transportation files showed reduced volume during the window. Cell tower coverage maps explained gaps in call data without implying intent. Each explanation returned to records, not inference. Emily Harrington's life was presented with restraint. Photographs showed a young woman at ordinary moments, a graduation cap, a holiday sweater, a kitchen table. The goal was context, not sentiment. Her routines were described through schedules and receipts. The prosecution avoided speculation about motives, focusing instead on what the evidence supported. The absence of intoxicants and the conservative autopsy conclusions were reiterated to prevent misinterpretation. The manner of death remained classified according to standards, with emphasis on trauma and exposure consistent with the scene. Expert witnesses explained fiber transfer in clear terms. The preserved fiber-matched material recovered from items associated with the suspect, consistent in composition and dye. The explanation stressed probability and limitations. Jurors heard that fibers do not tell stories alone. They corroborate presence when aligned with other data. The DNA expert described allele matches and statistical significance, grounding conclusions in numbers rather than rhetoric. Independent verification was noted, and the defense had access to all reports. The suspect's employment records were introduced without character judgment. Route assignments placed him near the pull-off during the relevant window. Maintenance logs showed the vehicle type and equipment used. Fuel receipts aligned with travel distances. A prior traffic citation established familiarity with the road. The relocation after the incident was addressed neutrally, acknowledging benign reasons while noting the temporal proximity. The case did not rely on that move to prove guilt. Throughout proceedings, the courtroom remained quiet. Observers noted the absence of outbursts. The town followed updates through the local paper, which printed summaries heavy on dates and filings. The seasonal timing weighed on the community. Snow fell outside the courthouse steps as calendars turned again toward December. For many residents, the case intersected with memories of their own routines, plowing driveways, shopping early, driving home before dark. Closing arguments returned to sequence and corroboration. The prosecution outlined the rebuilt timeline, beginning with Emily's early evening departure and ending at the pull-off, supported by data points rather than narrative flourish. The defense highlighted the years between events and arrest, urging caution. The jury was instructed on standards of proof, the evaluation of expert testimony, and the presumption of innocence. Deliberations extended into a second day, measured and private. The verdict arrived without announcement theatrics. The foreperson's words were recorded, and the record reflected the counts sustained. Sentencing followed weeks later, allowing for statements submitted in writing. The court considered statutory ranges and the gravity of harm. A sentence was imposed consistent with the law at the time of the offense, acknowledging the long delay but focusing on accountability. Appeals were noted as rights, not predictions. In the aftermath, investigators completed a final report, summarizing actions and lessons. The report emphasized evidence preservation, the value of revisiting cases with new tools, and the importance of patience. Emily Harrington's file was marked resolved. Her parents received certified copies of key documents and a personal briefing that avoided promises and platitudes. They returned to a quieter life with a measure of certainty they had lacked for years. The town adjusted. The pull-off was cleared and regraded. Seasonal maintenance continued. No memorial stood at the site by family preference. Each winter, plows traced the same routes and drivers passed without noticing the history beneath the snow. For the officers who carried the case, the resolution reinforced the discipline that defines cold casework. Time changes methods, not obligations. Records endure. When science advances, old questions can be answered without rewriting the past. The case closed not with applause but with filing stamps and archive transcripts. It stood as a reminder that even in small towns, procedures connect moments across decades. For an audience that has seen seasons repeat and systems tested, the conclusion offered a sober reassurance. Careful work, done lawfully and without hurry, can still bring clarity. Emily Harrington's name moved from uncertainty to record, and the winter roads returned to their ordinary silence. In the months after sentencing, the legal process continued in a quieter register, defined by filings rather than headlines. Appellate counsel submitted notices that preserved rights without introducing new facts. The arguments focused on procedure, challenging the scope of expert testimony and the application of genealogical research standards. The appellate court reviewed the record with attention to precedent, noting that the conviction rested on a traditional DNA comparison supported by warrants and corroborated by independent evidence. Briefs moved back and forth through winter, stamped and docketed, while the defendant remained in state custody under conditions consistent with policy. No stays were granted. The conviction stood. For the investigators, closure required documentation. A comprehensive after-action review was compiled, summarizing decisions taken across 2 decades. The review cataloged early missteps without blame, including delays caused by funding and technology limits that existed at the time. It praised evidence technicians who preserved materials beyond minimum requirements, a choice that later proved decisive. The report recommended expanded cold case audits every 5 years and clearer pathways for interagency grants. These recommendations were adopted quietly, folded into training modules rather than press releases. Emily Harrington's family navigated a different aftermath. They chose not to participate in public commentary beyond a brief written statement thanking investigators and jurors for diligence. The statement emphasized relief rather than triumph, acknowledging that no legal outcome could restore what was lost. Holidays returned with a new cadence. The empty chair remained, but questions no longer intruded. The family donated Emily's college textbooks to a local library, a small gesture consistent with her plans and temperament. The town of Bow and the surrounding communities absorbed the resolution without spectacle. There were no parades or vigils. The local paper ran a final article summarizing the appellate decision, printed below the weather forecast. Letters to the editor were measured, expressing gratitude for patience and respect for due process. For residents who had lived through the original winter, the case became part of the town's memory, referenced occasionally when discussions turned to road safety or the pace of justice. Seasonal rhythms persisted. Plow routes were updated, equipment replaced, and dispatch software modernized. Training emphasized documentation and chain of custody, lessons reinforced by the case. Younger officers learned the importance of methodical note-taking, even when answers seemed distant. Veterans spoke about restraint, about resisting narrative shortcuts. The discipline of cold casework, they explained, lies in preserving options for the future. From a broader perspective, the case contributed to evolving standards around forensic genealogy. Legal journals cited the decision in discussions of admissibility and scope. The emphasis on warrants and independent verification became a reference point. The caution shown by prosecutors, who treated genealogy as an investigative lead rather than evidence, was noted approvingly. This distinction mattered to courts balancing innovation with rights. Years passed again, but differently this time. The file remained accessible as a resolved case, used for training rather than inquiry. Emily Harrington's name appeared in footnotes and appendices, attached to procedures that would benefit others. The pull-off where evidence was found blended back into the landscape, a place of passing rather than pause. Winter storms came and went. Maintenance crews did their work. For the audience who followed the case, many of whom had lived through decades of changing headlines, the story offered a familiar lesson without sentimentality. Institutions function when records are kept and standards honored. Technology expands possibilities, but patience anchors outcomes. Justice, when it arrives late, must still meet the same thresholds as justice delivered swiftly. The defendant's appeals concluded without reversal. Sentence calculations were affirmed, Time credits were applied according to regulation. The correctional system absorbed the case as one among many, governed by routine. There were no further developments that altered the outcome. The law had spoken, and the record reflected it. In quiet moments, investigators revisited the early photographs, noting details once overlooked but now understood. The angles, the grade, the absence of footprints. Each detail had waited its turn. This reflection reinforced a professional humility about certainty and timing. Not every case resolves. Some do, when preparation meets opportunity. As another December approached, the town prepared for snow. Lights appeared along Main Street. Church bulletins listed services and closings. The memory of the case surfaced briefly, then receded. For Emily Harrington, the story ended with a lawful conclusion and a quiet aftermath. Her name remained in the record, attached to a sequence of careful acts that crossed seasons and years. The winter roads returned to their ordinary silence, carrying traffic and weather without comment as they always had. The final chapter of the case unfolded without ceremony, the way most lawful conclusions do, through schedules and signatures rather than speeches. After the appellate process closed, the clerk's office certified the judgment and transmitted copies to state archives. The docket reflected completion. The record showed no irregularities requiring correction. For those who value the machinery of justice, this quiet finality carried its own gravity. A case that began in the shadow of a December roadside had reached its end through measured adherence to process. Attention turned to preservation rather than pursuit. Evidence was either returned, destroyed, or retained for statutory periods, each decision documented. The biological samples that had anchored the prosecution were logged for retention, sealed anew, and stored according to updated standards. The remaining materials, photographs, notes, and reports were digitized to ensure longevity. The physical boxes that once filled a shelf were reduced to indexed files accessible for training and review. This transition marked a generational shift, from paper to server, from locked rooms to controlled access. The investigative team disbanded back into regular assignments. There were no commendations announced, no press conferences convened. Supervisors emphasized that the outcome belonged to the system, not individuals. In internal briefings, the case was discussed as a study in endurance. The early years illustrated the limits of contemporaneous technology. The later years demonstrated how preservation allows future tools to operate ethically. The lesson was not innovation alone, but readiness. Emily Harrington's family made a final request that the case not be revisited publicly without necessity. The request was honored. They returned to private life, marking holidays with routines that had once been impossible. The knowledge of accountability did not erase loss, but it steadied it. Grief settled into a form that allowed remembrance without interrogation. The family chose to support a local scholarship in Emily's name, focused on students balancing work and education, a reflection of her own path. The scholarship was announced quietly through a college bulletin and funded without fanfare. The community's relationship with the case evolved into memory. Residents who had taped flyers to shop windows removed them long ago, but the name remained familiar. Conversations about winter driving, roadside safety, and public works occasionally referenced the case as context rather than cautionary tale. The roads themselves bore no markers. Snowbanks rose and fell with the seasons. Maintenance crews cleared shoulders and repaired culverts, following updated routes and digital logs. For those who followed the proceedings from afar, particularly older viewers accustomed to slower news cycles, the resolution offered a particular kind of reassurance. The story did not hinge on confession or spectacle. It rested on records kept, evidence preserved, and standards maintained across time. The delay did not dilute the burden of proof. The The verdict did not rely on narrative force. It depended on alignment between data points that could withstand scrutiny. In professional circles, the case continued to circulate as an example of careful integration of new methods within existing legal frameworks. Training seminars referenced the importance of warrants, transparency, and corroboration. The distinction between investigative leads and courtroom evidence was underscored repeatedly. The case became part of a broader conversation about how justice systems adapt without abandoning restraint. The quiet aftermath extended to the site itself. The pull-off was indistinguishable from others along the road, its gravel refreshed, its drainage improved. Drivers passed without slowing. In winter, plows cleared it as a matter of routine. The place held no official designation, and none was sought. The absence of a marker was deliberate, a choice aligned with the family's wishes and the community's temperament. As years continued, the case receded further into the background, resurfacing only when files were reviewed for audits or when new officers studied resolved investigations. The name Emily Harrington appeared in indexes and citations, attached to procedures rather than uncertainty. The transition from open question to settled record was complete. For those who had worked the case from its beginning, the resolution prompted reflection on time itself. Seasons repeat, technologies change and people move on, but records remain. The discipline of writing things down, of sealing and labeling, of resisting assumptions, proved decisive. The case affirmed a belief shared by many seasoned investigators, that patience and rigor are not passive qualities but active commitments. The final legal outcome stood unchanged. The sentence was served under established rules. There were no further appeals that altered the judgment. The law's response was proportional, deliberate, and final. In this, the case differed from stories that end in ambiguity or unresolved questions. It concluded with clarity grounded in evidence. As another winter approached, the town prepared as it always had. Lights were hung, roads were salted, bulletins listed closures and services. The memory of the case surfaced briefly, then settled. For an audience that has lived through many such cycles, the conclusion offered a sober understanding. Justice does not announce itself loudly when done correctly. It arrives through continuity, through adherence to standards that outlast individual moments. Emily Harrington's story ended not with a headline but with a record entry marked resolved. The silence that followed was not empty. It was the silence of completion, of a question answered after many years. The winter roads continued under frost and light, carrying traffic and time forward, unchanged and unremarkable, as the system that finally spoke for her returned to its steady work.